Hey everybody, here to do another video. I'm actually sitting here in St. Petersburg, Florida. And don't worry, I'm going to move around and go from place to place. It's going to be great. But I'm here to tell you the history of this little town in Florida. Nice day out. Anyways, before we start, guys, check out the Patreon. Huge help. That's how I fund these things. There's all that stuff. A lot of extras on there. You get it. Also, like and subscribe. If you've seen one of these videos before, you know what's coming. Come on, just hit the freaking button. Helps to boost the algorithm. For those of you guys who are a little bit suspicious and going to hold out a little bit, all right, go ahead and watch the video. This should be a good one, man. I'm going to tell you a little history of this town. Very quickly growing town in Florida, baby. Gulf Coast. So I don't know what else to tell you other than let's get started. First stop. All right, so we're starting here on the water. This is where you got to start this video about St. Pete. First of all, everything you know about St. Pete and the Gulf Coast changed a lot right after the Ice Age. At the end of the Ice Age, the caps melted and everything. You actually took away about 200 miles of coastline from Florida. So all this stuff was pretty much exposed when the water kind of came up, and the animals here changed. There were, believe it or not, there were saber-toothed tigers running around this area back then. So where there's a Dunkin' Donuts, there were mastodons, you know, kind of nuts. So things changed, okay? So after the Ice Age, you know, for a dozen millennia or so, you had different Native Americans and different tribes kind of inhabiting around this area. And believe it or not, they had this harmony with the land. They took what they needed and they didn't take any more. What a concept. Fast forward to 1528, baby. And that is the year that Panfilo de Narvaez came here. Thank you very much. He came and he landed here with about 300 men. There's plaques here in this park, actually, where I am. It's called Jungle Prada, and it's named here and commemorates what they believe is around the area that he actually landed for the Empire of Spain. So this guy, believe it or not, was kind of an idiot. He had kind of a reputation for being kind of a dummy. So he actually encounters a tribe here, terrorizes them, and finds a golden rattle. Yeah, I guess even tribes, you know, aren't above, you know, tacky toys for their children. But he finds this golden rattle. He's like, whoa, gold, holy crap. So he says, I'm going to go north. He has advisors telling him, dude, this isn't a good idea, man. This isn't a good idea. But he says, shut your mouth. We're going north. So they go north. The boats kind of follow the path of what he's doing. They eventually are like, yeah, I think we think he's dead. So they basically took off, go back to Cuba. He's left with his men. They're still dying, they're still starving, including him, who dies on this trip. They finally make it to the north of Mexico, believe it or not, and there were four of them left. But this guy was the first one to kind of explore the East Coast, explore the Gulf Coast. So Narvaez gets killed because he doesn't listen to advice, thinks he can just find everything on his own, doesn't ask for directions. Typical man, am I right, ladies? But he dies, and for a long time, this area is pretty much isolated up until like including Florida. So the Spanish held on to Florida for a long time, and in fact, after the French and Indian War, the British took Florida for about 20 years. This is like the 1760s, till the end of the American Revolution, when they give it back. And then eventually, in the 1820s, it's ceded to the United States, partly because the Spanish Empire was crumbling. It was like kind of like a dumping ground for the United States, is where escaped slaves went. Different Native American tribes came here, and one of them actually mixed. They're different Creek Indians that mixed with fugitive slaves, etc., and they all formed a new tribe that was known as the Seminoles. The Seminoles was this new group of Native Americans here that were actually, you know, much more combative, and they fought and defended themselves. And in fact, one of the people who came in to take care of those Seminoles was Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson made a name for himself in the War of 1812, coming down here and battling them, and actually starting and fighting in the first Seminole War, one of 3 Seminole Wars here in Florida. It wasn't until the mid-1800s that Florida starts to kind of get settled, and it was because of the War of 1812 and because of those Seminole Wars that they established a Fort Brooke, over in what is today Tampa. And that was pretty much the first settlement, and that was in the 1840s. But before then, there really wasn't a whole lot here, other than the Native Americans who lived here. And here in this park, you have one of the many mounds that used to exist, and they were made of different shells and cast off from the food that the Native Americans would actually get from the water. This here in this park is the Tocobaga, they say, were the tribe that were located here, but they died off partly because of being slaughtered and partly because of disease. 1845, Florida gets its statehood pretty late. And remember, this is like was considered like an appendage to the South, to the United States. In fact, John Holmes, a senator for Maine, once famously said, it wouldn't be much of a loss to the United States if the entire peninsula of Florida just sank into the Gulf of Mexico. Yep, that's what they thought of Florida back then. I guess some things never change, but who's laughing now, Maine? You guys don't have any people compared to Florida. But yeah, kind of interesting. Anyways, things were about to change, so we're gonna go to the next spot and we'll talk about that. Yeah. All right, so it wasn't until the late 1800s that things started to happen in this area. All right, so first of all, there was a guy named Hamilton Diston who bought a ton of land. He bought 4 million acres, actually, a lot of them here on the Pinellas Peninsula for $1 million. That's a lot. That's a lot of land for only $1 million. Today, $1 million couldn't get you a dumpster in the swamp here, but back then it got him all this land. He wanted to start his own city here, Hamilton Diston, okay, remember that name. Other stuff starts happening around this time as well, the 1880s. This man named Henry Plant extends a railway from Kissimmee, closer to the east coast of Florida, to Tampa, where he wants to build his kind of city and empire. He builds hotels, he builds all this stuff. I talked about him in the Tampa video, which I talked about. There, okay, great. But this is the background, okay? 1886. This man named Peter Demens, who actually had a lumber yard in a town in Florida called Longwood. Yeah, go ahead, insert your joke there. That's great. Longwood, yep, lumberyard in Longwood. He actually was selling railroad ties to the Orange Belt Railway, and they couldn't pay for them. So they give him the railway. And he's like, well, it's over here. Where should I take this thing to? He decides to extend it here to the Pinellas Peninsula. He was thinking, oh, there was probably some promise here, nice weather, water. Maybe I can make a town here. First, he approaches this guy, Hamilton Diston. Diston tells him to go to heck. Let's keep this G. And then he actually stumbles on a guy named John C. Williams. I'm actually here in Williams Park, named after him. This was opened in the 1890s. And he was a guy who basically said, all right, I'll give you some land. He was a millionaire. He lived in Tampa at the time. He had all this land here. And he says, all right, I'll give you some land for your little railway. And he opens this actual railway. He extends it to this area through Williams's land, and they become the founders of St. Petersburg. Look at that. And in fact, they named St. Petersburg after the town in St. Petersburg, Russia, where Demens was from. Isn't that cool? It's a good thing he wasn't from the town of Poop, Mexico. And if you're wondering if that's a real place, yeah, it's a real place. But they named it St. Petersburg. There's actually like a legend that it was actually over a coin flip between Williams and Demens, and it was either going to be Detroit or St. Petersburg, but that's just an urban myth, urban legend, if you will. But they did name a hotel here, the Detroit Hotel, in honor of Williams, who actually is from Detroit. Oh, look at that. And Peter Demens was Russian. I know it doesn't sound like it, but his real name was Pyotr Alexievich Dementiev. Which you could just imagine playing with like the Tetris song in the background. It's so Russian. But that was what he changed his name to Peter Demens because he wanted to sound more American, you know, get rid of that Russian stigma, I don't know, but he changed his name to Peter Demens. So this park was open in 1894. It's seen, you know, Buster Keaton got a key to the city here in this park. Orson Welles actually spoke here supposedly, and interestingly enough, they had a World War I memorial here where they mentioned the 16 St. Petersburg residents who died in World War I. 2 of them were black, and they put colored next to their names, which that plaque, unfortunately, like a lot of the retirees here, did not age well. So by 1890, St. Petersburg had about 1,000, over 1,500 residents, but it was about to change a lot in the early 1900s. And we'll talk about that at our next stop. So in the early 1900s, some developments happened that allowed St. Petersburg to begin to grow a little more quickly. Well, first of all, the Orange Belt Railway was improved. It was a real piece of crud initially. In fact, it was really slow. And sometimes the passengers had to help shovel, you know, wood and stuff to keep the actual engines going themselves. That's a really crappy ride when you not only have to deal with it being slow, but you also have to contribute to it being slow. Automobiles started to grow in popularity by World War I, and after World War I, automobiles became more popular, more affordable. But another thing that happened was you had the first ever, from St. Pete, commercial airline flight. Oh, on January 1st, 1914, Tony Jannus flew the first commercial flight from St. Pete to Tampa, cutting the time that it took to get there. Unfortunately, the airline completely failed, but it was the first, and it did show that airline travel, or airplane travel, could be something more than just kind of novelty. Before then, it was just kind of done as like, it was like stunt flying and for tricks and things like that. But he proved that you could actually make a career out of it, make a real like industry out of it. Anyways, this is a monument to good old Tony Jannus, who unfortunately died 2 years later at the young age of 27 in an airplane crash. Yeah, go figure. So you had all these developments happening. Obviously, you had automobile travel growing. You had the railways also improving, and Henry B. Plant died. And Henry Plant actually was one of the reasons why St. Pete, well, he blocked St. Pete from growing a little bit because he wanted Tampa to be the main thing. And once he died, they were able to connect the Tampa railways and things to the St. Pete railways. So certain things started to happen in favor of St. Pete growing. William Straub also was the St. Pete Times editor-in-chief from the early 1900s to the 1930s, and he pushed a lot for this waterfront to be turned into parks. In fact, St. Pete has a lot of 9% of its land is parks, which is pretty cool, and it's pretty rare. So he helped keep all this waterfront parks, which is pretty amazing considering today waterfront is like, you have to freaking spend a lot of money to live on the waterfront because that's where all the condos and stuff are built. But here, right on the waterfront, is parkland, and that's pretty interesting. You had people like Charles Roser, who actually bought a lot of land here near St. Pete's downtown, opened Roser Park, which, by the way, he was actually the inventor of Fig Newtons. And he sold it to Nabisco. And with that money, he came here and he, retired like most people do. And here's a little trivia for you, Silvio. Nabisco, you know why it's called Nabisco?
I do not.
National Biscuit Company, Nabisco.
Hey-o.
Damn, that's what it's called, for real. That's why it's called Nabisco. Yeah, look at that, man. Lots of, I actually covered the Nabisco factory in one of my videos when in Chelsea or Meatpacking District, one of those two. Anyway, there you go, baby. You got to watch these. I'm going to put links in these things. You got to watch them, all right? Get yourself an education, huh? All right, but yeah, pretty cool. First airline. Abe File was the first passenger. He was actually a former mayor of St. Pete. When he arrived in Tampa and got off the plane, his first words were, "What's the deal with airline food?" Okay. All right, well, that's the, that's one of the main developments was the transportation changing and improving, getting people here to St. Pete. Also, the land being scooped up and developed. Let's talk about another one at our next stop. Okay, so unfortunately I had to come back here to where I started because I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about some of the developments here in St. Pete. And, if you watch this, look at this video. Look at that. The lighting and the sound. It was unfortunately screwed up. So I got to do it here, but it's okay. Got some B-roll, and I want to tell you some history, and then we'll get back to it. Anyways, one of the big developments in St. Pete, one of the things that it was famous for early on was baseball. In fact, this man named Al Lang made it kind of his mission. He was kind of a leader here in the neighborhood, and he made it his mission to bring baseball to St. Pete. People were playing amateurs and stuff here, but he brought the first team he brought here was the St. Louis Browns, the famous St. Louis Browns. I'm sure you guys are all dusting off your St. Louis Browns hats. But then he brought the Phillies here, and the Phillies came in 1915, and that year they won 14 out of their first 15 games and made it kind of a thing. Everyone's like, oh, there must be something to the St. Pete place and spring training there. So teams followed, and in 1925, a big get was the New York Yankees. That's right, the famous Yankees. And in fact, in 1930, Babe Ruth supposedly hit his longest home run of his entire career here in St. Pete, 624 feet. It went out of the stadium, rolled up, and hit the door of a hotel. And when he made his farewell tour, he actually stopped through St. Pete in 1948, and they asked him what his greatest accomplishment here was, and he said, when I hit that ball against that hotel. Don't worry, bleeped it out to save your innocent ears. Here, this is, well, not here, but here in the video would have been Tropicana Field. Tropicana Field was built by St. Pete in 1990 with the idea of eventually bringing professional baseball to the city. It worked. In 1995, they got the Tampa Bay Devil Rays. Known today as the Tampa Bay Rays because, I guess the owners didn't want to go to hell. So they take that devil off, good old devil, and today the Rays are actually pretty good. And sometimes, or at least back in the day when they really wanted people to come to the games, it would have like, different bands and stuff like Third Eye Blind would play or something. After the game, you could come watch, MC Hammer or something as well as taking a baseball game. Another thing that was happening too, and he made it a kind of a mission of his, was Al Lang helped bring tourism to St. Pete in the early 1900s. A lot of tourists started coming here. There were lots of what they called tin can tourists, and these were people who just kind of set up shop in their RVs and things like that, their vans, and they set up tents. Also, another thing that they started doing was there were so many tourists early on that they set up tourist societies. So they would have like the Illinois and Indiana, etc. So when you came here, you didn't have to hang out with any of those disgusting locals. You could just hang out with people from your hometown. How great is that? What kind of tourism is that? But it was, I guess a signal of how much it was growing. And also the idea of tourism itself was fairly new. And traveling itself hadn't developed as much. But those were all things that were going on at the time. Keep in mind that as the tourism was growing, so was the population. From the year 1920 to 1940, the population of St. Pete tripled. So this was a real hot time for not just tourism, not just baseball, but also growth and real estate speculation. That's right. So we'll talk about this more at our next stop. Let's keep it moving, baby. Come on. Okay, so all of the developments we've just talked about paved the way for the boom that was to hit St. Pete and Florida in the 1920s. Okay, so just to give you an idea, these were the post-war years, World War I. Okay, so there was a huge boom around Florida. There's a huge boom here in St. Pete. To give you an idea, the population of Florida grew 51% in the 1920s. Here in St. Pete, from 1910, they had about a little 4,700 people. By 1930, there was 30,000 people. Look at that, huge growth. So there were a couple reasons for this boom, but a big part of it was the tourism that increased, right? And playing into it were the hotels that were built. In the 1920s, 11 hotels were built, including this one. This one is called the Vinoy, very fancy. It was actually built by a man named Amer Vinoy Loeffner. And the story goes that he was actually at a party and talking with this guy named Walter Hagen, who was a golfer. He made a bet that Hagen could hit golf balls off of his watch and not break the watch. So he put the watch down, started whacking some golf balls, and it didn't break. $170,000 goes straight to Amer. I don't know why Hagen didn't just start bashing the watch and was like, oh yeah, well you lose. But I guess he was honest. And he won $170,000. And they say that at the party, some guy suggested, hey, with that money, you should start a hotel in this booming town of St. Pete. Either way, he started this hotel shortly after, and it became the Vinoy. Very fancy little hotel. In fact, people like Babe Ruth have stayed here, Ernest Hemingway, Marilyn Monroe, Jimmy Stewart. Huh? Yeah, that's right. I stayed at the Vinoy. Yeah, I'm Jimmy Stewart. I stayed at the Vinoy. That was a pretty good impression, right, Silvio?
That was great.
Thanks. But yeah, you had other hotels like this in the neighborhood. Another thing that happened in this time was other tourists who couldn't afford hotels like this stayed in places called, what they called tin can tourists, stayed in like these tent cities, and actually became kind of a big deal. But these were the forerunners to mobile home parks, trailer parks. Hate to say it, but what's more Florida than that, huh? People were also trying to get away from the north where things were a little more tumultuous, lots of union activity, all these different things. And people were like, get us out of here, let's go down to the weather in Florida. And that's when you get things catering to these tourists, things like the St. Petersburg Shuffleboard Club. Remember when I said that trailer parks are the most Florida thing? I think a shuffleboard club is actually just a little more Florida than that. And that's all that happened in the 1920s here in St. Pete. Huh? Pretty frickin' cool. All right, well, I say we go to the next spot and show how it also was going through other changes around the same time. This is the Vinoy. It's pink. All right. Okay, unfortunately I'm back here where we're sitting to tell you another development. I tried to do this one on location too, but the sound kind of messed up. Check it out, this is what it would have looked like. But the reason I'm at that spot is because that is the Gandy Bridge. The Gandy Bridge was a huge development in St. Pete's history. So this guy, George Gandy, visits St. Pete in the early 1900s, 1902. And this wasn't your typical tourist, man. This guy, he wasn't just coming here to go to the outlets and go home. This guy saw potential. He's like, you know what if there was a bridge to take you from Tampa, which is a little more populated, etc., over to St. Pete that could help grow this whole thing? So that's exactly what he did. He took the initiative himself. He started raising money, etc., and by 1926 the Gandy Bridge was finished. This was a huge deal. It cut down the time it took to get from Tampa to St. Pete from like 12 hours to like 2 hours. That was big because it helped the city and the neighborhoods to grow very quickly. The bridge brought more people and more tourists. And we talked about the tin can tourists already, but you also had motels popping up. Just on 4th Street, which was one of the main thoroughfares, you had like almost 100 hotels, just motels, sorry, on this street. Today, a lot of those old motel buildings, you can drive down and see these like, old like Art Deco motels and all that. And today they're chiropractors or, personal injury attorneys, the two state mascots here in Florida. But the remnants are still there. You also had different businesses popping up to cater to these tourists. For example, in 1903, you had this guy who was a plumber who actually bought some of this land here on 4th Street, and he because he knew about draining and all that stuff, he turned this little like drained area into basically these gardens with water and wildlife, and it became what is still there today, Sunken Gardens. This is nice. It eventually became a nursery, and now today, and then it became like a admission park and all that. And at one point was one of the biggest attractions in Florida, just a garden. Today you'd need a freaking roller coaster and, a rat dressed up in red pants to get kids to go. But back then, it was a simpler time, And you also had another big post-World War II development that helped populate and bring tourists, and that was air conditioning. Whoo, Lord, I don't know if you can tell, but right now I'm sweating, baby, and it's because it's hot here. And once you had air conditioning, you had people who say, oh, you know what, I'll give it a shot now, and I don't have to sweat through my undies. I could just kind of come and hang out. So that was another big development. All of this kind of starting with the opening of the Gandy Bridge helped St. Pete to continue to grow. The Gandy Bridge back there, which also, by the way, famous for street racing. People always late at night on the weekends, especially street racing over there. No, you wouldn't think it. I guess I'll save it for Fast and the Furious 17. Meet me at Hooters. I don't know what they're going to call them by that point, but yeah, it's street racing. Pretty cool. Anyways, I don't know. That's the Gandy Bridge, baby. Let's keep this moving. All right, another thing that developed alongside of St. Pete's history was its African-American community. It's always kind of had a big black population here. In fact, after the Orange Belt Railway was finished, a lot of those laborers were African-American and they moved here and settled in St. Pete. That's 1888. I'm actually standing in a neighborhood known as the Deuces, which is 22nd Street South. Pretty cool name. A little in a 10-block radius, to give you an idea, at one point there were 111 black-owned businesses in this area. Now, just so you know, legal segregation, like legally sanctioned segregation, didn't end until the 1960s here in St. Pete. And at one point, this was the only place in the city where black people were allowed to live. And it was so policed that not only were the African Americans who lived here not allowed to go into white neighborhoods, whites weren't even allowed to come here. It was completely cut off. And Pinellas, sadly, even after the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, it took about 10 years still to start, I guess, desegregating the schools here in St. Pete, which was very slow, but sadly was actually pretty fast compared to the rest of Florida, believe it or not, here in Pinellas County. So those kind of things happen, but you had a thriving community here in the Deuces, and I'm actually standing in front of what used to be the Royal Theater. Another group that thrived here was the Jewish population, because other parts of St. Pete also wouldn't let Jews start their own businesses and things, and some of them started businesses and things in this neighborhood as well. So it kind of opened its doors to the discriminated against in St. Pete here in the Deuces. And you had this one man named Elder Jordan Sr. Elder was actually his first name. Pretty cool. He was actually born a slave and worked his way up, was able to buy some land here in the neighborhood, and eventually donated land to create the Jordan Park housing development. He also created a theater that eventually became the Manhattan Casino. And, it saw a lot of really amazing acts pass through there. Ray Charles, Nat King Cole, Otis Redding came through there. Pretty cool. He's the guy who sings that song. Sitting on the dock of the bay, wasting time. That's pretty good, right, Silvio?
That was amazing.
Thank you very much. Anyways, this is the Deuces, a very still a thriving black neighborhood here in the city. Lots of black-owned businesses. The Royal Theater behind me is now a Boys and Girls Club. Also, what used to happen is St. Pete, to attract tourists, used to downplay its black population. In fact, in 1910, over a quarter of the population of St. Pete was black, and St. Pete would underreport it for its statistics, underreport it in its, brochures and promotional materials, so people wouldn't be afraid to come and visit or buy land here, which is kind of insane if you think about it. They felt the need to lie about it, but that's what was going on back then, and it's a very important part of history, and you can't ignore it. That's why we're here. That's why we're talking about this. But also a really nice neighborhood today. Yeah, it's the Deuces. And that's the video, guys. We covered a ton. Thank you guys for sticking through it. We covered the landing of the conquistadores. We we talked about the Native Americans who were here. We talked about, the development of the hotels, the development of the, trailer parks. We talked about baseball. We talked about, all this kind of stuff. Very, very interesting. And today, Tampa and St. Pete, actually, I read one article. So it's true. It was in an article that Tampa St. Pete is actually the #3 fastest growing city in the United States, which is wild. But it is St. Pete. It's very nice. I recommend you check it out. Sorry for any of the technical difficulties, but you still got the history, and that's what matters. You got to learn something. So that's pretty much it, guys. If you enjoyed the video, please, like I said, check out the Patreon. Support. That's how I grow. That's how I fund these things, all that stuff. Also, like and subscribe. That's how we bump us in the analytics, baby. I head up all the, jet ski fails, and here in Florida, those are popular. It's going to be tough to surpass those, and tough to stop watching them, to be honest. What are they doing on those jet skis? But anyways, yeah, guys, thanks for watching, and I guess I'll see you later.